Questions. Over the past few weeks, our Democratic colleagues have suggested the following. After the initial release of the GDP report, the president is driving the economy into a recession. Chairman Powell, the latest FOMC statement described economic activity to continue to expand at a solid pace, and you just reiterated that in your testimony this morning. In your view, is the term recession and the economy growing at a solid pace, are those synonymous with each other?
Welcome back to America First, Patriots. Before we dive into today's critical analysis, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing you the truth that the mainstream media won't tell you, and your support keeps us fighting for America's future. Today, we're breaking down Jerome Powell's recent testimony before Congress. And folks, what we're seeing here is a masterclass in political theater while our economy hangs in the balance.
I would say no.
And you note that the labor market continues strong, the economy's at a standard pace, and you also referenced in your testimony that first quarter GDP initial react was also from front-end loading, as you noted, imports to try to avoid tariff impacts. Also, I looked at the Atlanta Fed GDP Now model, which forecasts GDP growth for the second quarter of this year at nearly 4%, with core GDP forecast at 2%. Does that Atlanta model suggest a recession to you?
No, I would say it doesn't.
So in looking at your remarks about tariffs today and then the ones that you made during March and April, I was looking back at a Fed study that noted that up until March, tariffs have already been partially passed through in consumer prices, leading to a contribution of merely 0.1 percentage point increase in core PCE prices. And a Harvard study last week showed that prices have only modestly adjusted since the announcement of tariffs. Finally, the longer-term inflation expectations remain consistent with the 2% goal. Governor Waller laid out a pathway that allows for rate cuts provided that average effective tariff rates remain close to 10%, or I assume he means 10% or lower. The labor market remains solid. Prices continue to disinflate. So given that data I've outlined, I'm sure data that you're very familiar with, for the economy to avoid persistent inflation, do you concur with Governor Waller that there is a pathway for good news as it relates to the regulatory policies, the tax policies that I've discussed, in a world with lower tariff rates?
So first, I wouldn't comment on any other FOMC members' comments one way or the other, but I will say this. I think many paths are possible here, and certainly the one you mentioned is a possible one. We could see inflation come in not as strong as we expect, and if that were the case, that would tend to suggest cutting sooner. We could see the labor market weakening, and that would also suggest cutting sooner. On the other hand, if we see inflation coming in higher, or if the labor market were to remain strong, then we would probably be moving later. So I think a range of possible paths are possible, and certainly the one you mentioned is one of them.
In February of 2021, you told us in this committee that you would stay in your lane and not comment on President Biden's proposal for the American Rescue Plan or sharply increasing federal spending. And, you said it was an issue, but that you would stay in your lane and not comment on it. But here in this year, you have commented on this idea of tariffs being set by the executive branch. So are tariffs in your lane, but a huge fiscal spending by the Biden administration not in your lane? Explain to the committee why you chose to be silent in February of 21, but outspoken this spring.
Sure. So we haven't commented, and it would be inappropriate for us to comment on the policy of tariffs. We don't have a view. It's not our job, and we just wouldn't do that. And just as we wouldn't comment on the reconciliation package that you're working on right now. We're not commenting on tariffs. What our job is inflation, keeping inflation under control, and also keeping maximum employment. And when policies have what appear to be short and medium-term implications, meaningful implications for that, then they kind of, not the policies themselves, but the inflation becomes our job.
Yeah. My views on price stability. I think it's a first among equals in your dual mandate. I've argued for that. I've introduced legislation to make the dual mandate the sole mandate, and we've talked about that before, but I was very curious about your thoughts on former president of the Cleveland Bank, Loretta Mester's quote that I read from last fall. She says, "I think that maximum employment is the maximum level of employment consistent with price stability." In other words, she elegantly ties that together, that price stability is what you can have more control over rather than all these other factors that enter the employment picture like legislative and executive branch. What's your thought about her quote?
I personally think that's a very reasonable way to think about it.
Thank you very much. I yield back. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Let's cut through the establishment talking points and get to the real issues facing hardworking Americans. First, let's address the elephant in the room. We have Democrats in Congress trying to paint our economy as heading toward recession, while Powell is sitting there saying everything is fine with his solid pace language. This is exactly the kind of Washington doublespeak that has gotten us into this mess in the first place. The American people are feeling real pain at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and in their monthly bills. But the Fed chair is talking about technical economic models, like they mean something to families struggling to make ends meet. What really caught my attention was this discussion about tariffs. Now, as conservatives, we understand that tariffs are a tool of American sovereignty. When we use tariffs strategically, we're protecting American workers, American industries, and American interests. But notice how Powell dances around this issue, claiming the Fed doesn't comment on policy while simultaneously commenting on policy. This is the kind of bureaucratic games that frustrate real Americans who want straight answers. The congressman brings up a crucial point about the Atlanta Fed's GDP model, showing nearly 4% growth. If that's accurate, then why are we even having conversations about recession? This tells me that either the data is being manipulated to fit a narrative, or there's a fundamental disconnect between what the experts are measuring and what Americans are actually experiencing in their daily lives. Here's what really gets me fired up. Powell admits that tariffs have only contributed 1/10 of a percentage point to core inflation. 1/10. That completely destroys the narrative that protecting American industry through tariffs is what's driving inflation. The real drivers of inflation are the massive government spending programs, the money printing that happened during COVID, and the anti-energy policies that have driven up costs across the board. When the congressman asks about Governor Waller's pathway for rate cuts, Powell gives us this wishy-washy response about multiple possible paths. This is exactly the problem with the Federal Reserve System. They're supposed to be managing our monetary policy, but they're basically admitting they don't know what they're doing. They're reactive, not proactive. They're following political winds instead of economic fundamentals. The most telling moment in this entire exchange is when Powell gets called out for staying silent on Biden's massive spending packages in 2021, but then commenting on tariff policy. This exposes a political bias that runs deep in these institutions. When Democrats want to spend trillions of dollars that we don't have, Powell stays in his lane. But when we talk about policies that actually protect American workers and American sovereignty, suddenly he has opinions. Let's talk about what this means for regular Americans. The Federal Reserve has been playing games with our currency for decades. They print money when it's politically convenient. They keep interest rates artificially low to prop up asset bubbles. And they serve the interests of Wall Street over Main Street. This hearing shows that nothing has changed. The discussion about maximum employment being tied to price stability is interesting from a constitutional perspective. The Federal Reserve wasn't even supposed to exist according to our founding principles. The Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value, not some unelected board of governors who serve the banking establishment. What we're seeing here is a perfect example of how the deep state operates. They use complex economic jargon to confuse the American people while they manipulate policy behind closed doors. Powell talks about short-term and medium-term implications, but he's not talking about the long-term destruction of American prosperity that these policies create. The real question Americans should be asking is this: why do we have a Federal Reserve System that serves international banking interests instead of American interests? Why do we have monetary policy that benefits Wall Street speculators while crushing middle-class savers? Why do we have a system that allows unelected bureaucrats to make decisions that affect every American family? This hearing demonstrates that our economic problems aren't just technical issues that can be solved with the right monetary policy. They're fundamental problems with how our system is structured. We have a Federal Reserve that prioritizes global economic stability over American economic sovereignty. We have politicians who care more about appeasing international markets than protecting American workers. Patriots, the solution isn't more technocratic management from the federal. The solution is returning to constitutional principles, supporting policies that put America first, and holding these institutions accountable to the American people. We need leaders who understand that our economic policy should serve American interests, not global interests. The congressman's point about making price stability the sole mandate instead of the dual mandate is worth considering. When you try to serve two masters, you end up serving neither effectively. The Fed's track record on both employment and inflation shows they're not particularly good at either job. What this hearing really shows is that we need fundamental reform of our monetary system. We need transparency, accountability, and policies that serve American workers instead of international finance. We need to end the era of easy money that has created massive wealth inequality and destroyed the purchasing power of the American dollar. The bottom line is this: the Federal Reserve System is broken, and Jerome Powell's testimony proves it. They're out of touch with the reality that American families face every day. They're more concerned with managing political narratives than solving actual economic problems. That's why we need to keep fighting for America First policies, whether it's strategic use of tariffs to protect our industries, energy independence to lower costs for families, or fiscal responsibility to stop the endless money printing that devalues our currency. Keep fighting, patriots. The establishment wants you to believe that these complex economic issues are too complicated for regular Americans to understand. That's not true. What's happening to our economy is a direct result of policies that prioritize global interests over American interests, and it's time we demand better. Make sure you're subscribed to America First for more honest analysis that you won't get anywhere else. Hit that notification bell, share this video with fellow patriots, and keep holding these institutions accountable. Together, we're going to restore American prosperity and American sovereignty. God bless America, and we'll see you in the next video.